On a quiet Sunday morning in a small American town, more than 400 people sat in silence, waiting for their pastor to speak. For 15 years, he had been their guide, their counselor, their voice of reason. He had baptized their children, buried their parents, saved their marriages, and listened to their darkest fears. They trusted him with everything. What they didn't know was that he had been listening for a very different reason. Because behind the calm voice, the gentle smile, and the message of healing, he was quietly building control over their lives. And by the time the truth surfaced, half the town was too afraid to speak. When Pastor Daniel Mercer first arrived in the town of Ridgewood, Ohio, he didn't look like someone with power. He was soft-spoken, unassuming. In his early 40s, with calm eyes and a measured way of speaking that made people feel instantly safe. The church he inherited was struggling. Attendance was declining. The building needed repairs. Morale was low. Within a year, everything changed. Attendance doubled. Then tripled. Families who had stopped attending years earlier came back. New members arrived from neighboring towns. Donations increased. The building was renovated. Community programs expanded. But the real change wasn't the growth. It was the atmosphere. People described it the same way. Peaceful. Safe. Different. Daniel had a gift not just for preaching, but for listening. After every service, he stayed late, talking one-on-one with anyone who needed him. Marriages in crisis. Teenagers struggling with anxiety. Business owners dealing with financial pressure. Parents worried about their children. He remembered names, details, private worries. And he followed up. A text message during the week. A phone call. An invitation to private counseling. In a world where most people felt unseen, Daniel made them feel known. And that kind of attention builds loyalty faster than any sermon ever could. Over time, his role expanded beyond pastor. People began asking him for life decisions. Should they take a job? Move cities? End a relationship? Invest in a business? Daniel never told them what to do directly. Instead, he would pause, ask questions, and guide them toward what he called the path of peace. The phrase became part of the church culture. If you're unsure, talk to Pastor Daniel. He'll help you find clarity. He hears things others don't. What most people didn't realize was how carefully he gathered information. During counseling sessions, he encouraged full honesty. Financial struggles. Relationship problems. Family conflicts. Addictions. Mental health diagnoses. He framed it as spiritual transparency. Confession brings freedom. And people told him everything. About 3 years into his leadership, Daniel introduced something new. Accountability groups. Small circles of 5 to 8 members who met weekly to discuss their personal struggles and spiritual growth. Each group reported to a trained leader. And those leaders reported to Daniel. On paper, it looked like a support system. In practice, it created a detailed map of the private lives of hundreds of people. Who was struggling financially? Who was having marriage problems? Who felt isolated? Who was vulnerable? And vulnerability, when placed in the wrong hands, becomes leverage. At first, the influence was subtle. If someone mentioned considering a new job in another city, Daniel would express concern. Leaving your support system during a fragile season might not be wise. If a couple talked about switching churches, he would gently question their motives. Sometimes discomfort is a sign we're being challenged to grow, not to run. People trusted him. So they stayed. Then came the financial guidance. During a sermon series about faith and provision, Daniel encouraged members to increase their giving not as obligation, but as a demonstration of trust. Those who did were praised publicly. Those who didn't received private counseling. Many later said the conversations followed a pattern. First, concern. Are you struggling financially? Then insight. I've noticed a pattern of fear around money. Then spiritual framing. Sometimes withholding is a sign of deeper mistrust. And finally, quiet pressure. Let's work on aligning your actions with your faith. Donations continued to rise. But something else rose with them. Dependence. The first person to feel uneasy was a woman named Karen Ellis. Karen had been a member for 6 years. She trusted Daniel deeply. He had helped her through a divorce and the death of her mother. When she began dating someone outside the church, she mentioned it during a counseling session. Daniel didn't react strongly at first. But over the next few weeks, her accountability group began asking questions. Do you feel he supports your spiritual growth? Are you sure this relationship is healthy for your season? Then Daniel called her in. He spoke calmly. I'm concerned this relationship is pulling you away from your support system. Karen tried to explain that she was happy. Daniel listened. Nodded. Then he said something that stayed with her. Sometimes what feels good emotionally isn't what's safe spiritually. Within 2 months, Karen ended the relationship. At the time, she believed it was her decision. Years later, she wasn't so sure. The pattern repeated across the church. Members began consulting Daniel before major life choices. Some delayed career opportunities. Others ended friendships outside the church. A few even moved closer to Ridgewood after Daniel suggested proximity would strengthen their community. What no one noticed was how their world was slowly shrinking. Church events replaced outside activities. Church friendships replaced old ones. Church guidance replaced independent decision-making. And at the center of it all was Daniel. 5 years into his leadership, the church launched its largest project yet. A community counseling center. It would offer affordable therapy, addiction recovery programs, and family services. The town praised the initiative. Local officials attended the opening. Daniel became more than a pastor. He became a community leader. The center collected intake forms, mental health histories, financial information, family dynamics. All confidential. All stored securely. And all ultimately accessible to Daniel. It wasn't until a former staff member left that anyone questioned the system. Her name was Melissa Grant. She had worked as an administrative coordinator at the counseling center for 2 years. Melissa believed in the mission. She admired Daniel. But over time, she noticed something unusual. During leadership meetings, Daniel referenced personal details about members that hadn't come through pastoral counseling. Medical diagnoses. Medication changes. Private therapy notes. At first, she assumed clients had signed consent forms. Then one afternoon, she was asked to pull a file. When she opened it, she realized the client had never authorized pastoral access. The information had been copied anyway. Melissa asked her supervisor. The answer was simple. Pastor Daniel needs the full picture to guide people effectively. That explanation didn't sit right. But questioning Daniel wasn't easy. In Ridgewood, he wasn't just respected. He was trusted, almost without question. Around the same time, a man named Robert Hale stopped attending church. Robert had been a member for nearly a decade. He ran a small construction company and had donated significant time and money to church projects. When his business began struggling, he sought counseling. Daniel encouraged him to stay faithful with his giving. Provision follows obedience. Robert increased his donations, even as his company lost contracts. 6 months later, his business failed. When Robert approached Daniel for financial assistance from the church, the response was careful but distant. The church can provide prayer and emotional support, but we can't intervene in every financial hardship. Robert felt betrayed. But what unsettled him most came later. During a conversation with another former member, he realized something. Several people had been encouraged to increase giving during financial stress. All of them had trusted Daniel's guidance. And all of them had suffered financially afterward. Still, no one spoke publicly. Because for every uncomfortable story, there were dozens of positive ones. Saved marriages. Recovered addictions. Families reunited. Daniel's reputation remained strong. And that's what made the truth so difficult to see. Control doesn't always look like force. Sometimes it looks like care. Sometimes it sounds like wisdom. And sometimes, it feels like help. The first real fracture came from inside the leadership team. During a quarterly review, one elder raised concerns about the amount of personal data being collected through accountability groups and counseling records. Daniel listened quietly. Then he asked a question. Do you believe people are safer when we understand their struggles, or when we leave them to handle things alone? The room fell silent. No one wanted to argue against safety. After the meeting, the elder was asked to step down due to what Daniel described as misalignment with the church's vision. Most members never knew the conversation had happened. But within leadership circles, the message was clear. Questioning the system meant losing your place in it. Meanwhile, Melissa Grant was still uneasy. After leaving her position, she kept thinking about the files. The access. The information. And one detail she couldn't ignore. Some counseling notes included comments that didn't come from licensed therapists. They were labeled simply pastoral observation. She began contacting former clients she trusted. At first, the responses were defensive. Pastor Daniel would never misuse information. He's helped my family more than anyone. But then one woman hesitated. She mentioned that Daniel had referenced details in a meeting that she had only shared with her therapist. That conversation changed everything. Because confidentiality wasn't just being blurred. It was being broken. Melissa contacted a local attorney. The advice was cautious. If medical or mental health records had been accessed without proper authorization, there could be legal implications. But proving it would require documentation. And documentation meant cooperation. From people who still trusted Daniel. Or were afraid of what might happen if they didn't. By the time the investigation quietly began, Daniel Mercer had been leading Ridgewood for nearly 10 years. He had married couples. Dedicated babies. Counseled hundreds of families. Built programs. Expanded facilities. And positioned himself as the emotional center of an entire community. Which meant that exposing him wouldn't just challenge a pastor. It would challenge the foundation of trust the town had built around him. And when trust becomes identity, people don't let it go easily. The first formal complaint came from someone no one expected. A licensed therapist who had worked at the counseling center. She reported that client notes were being copied and shared with pastoral leadership without proper consent. The state licensing board opened a preliminary inquiry. At first, the church dismissed it as a misunderstanding. Then reporters began asking questions. And for the first time in a decade, Daniel Mercer faced something he couldn't control. Public scrutiny. That Sunday, attendance was higher than ever. Daniel stood at the pulpit, calm as always. His message was about storms. About faith under attack. About standing firm when outside forces try to divide what God has built. The congregation applauded. Many left feeling reassured. But outside the building, two former members stood across the street, watching. One of them said quietly, "If people knew what he knew about them, they'd understand why no one speaks up." Because the real power Daniel held wasn't money. Or influence. Or position. It was information. Secrets. Fears. Private struggles. The kind of things people would do almost anything to keep from becoming public. And if those people began to believe their pastor might use that knowledge against them, silence would feel safer than truth. Within weeks, more stories began to surface. Not of violence. Not of crime in the traditional sense. But of something quieter. Pressure. Dependence. Boundaries crossed in ways that were hard to prove but impossible to ignore. Former members described a pattern. If someone began pulling away from the church, Daniel would request a meeting. He never threatened. He never raised his voice. But he would reference their struggles. Financial concerns. Marriage issues. Mental health history. Always framed as care. Always delivered gently. But the message underneath was clear. I know what you're going through. For some, it felt supportive. For others, it felt like a reminder. Leaving meant losing your support system. And possibly, your privacy. Then came the document that changed everything. A former leadership volunteer came forward with internal training materials. The manual outlined how group leaders should document members' struggles. How to identify resistance. How to escalate concerns to pastoral staff. And one phrase appeared repeatedly. Maintain relational leverage to guide decision-making. When a local journalist published that phrase, the story spread beyond Ridgewood. What had once looked like a supportive community now looked structured. Strategic. Controlled. Still, many members defended Daniel. He's helped too many people to be dangerous. This is being taken out of context. He's under attack because he's effective. And that division became the town's new reality. Some saw a shepherd under scrutiny. Others saw a system built on psychological control. And as the investigation widened, one question began to surface again and again. If Daniel Mercer truly believed he was helping people, how far had he gone to keep that influence? And what would happen if the people who trusted him most finally stopped being afraid? The investigation didn't explode all at once. It grew slowly, almost quietly. At first, it was just a licensing inquiry into the counseling center. A review of procedures. Consent forms. Data access policies. Church leadership released a brief statement. We are fully cooperating and confident this review will confirm our commitment to ethical care. Inside the congregation, Daniel addressed it only once. He stood at the front of the sanctuary and spoke in the same calm tone his members had trusted for years. When people are doing meaningful work, questions will come. Scrutiny is part of serving others at a high level. He didn't mention complaints. He didn't mention records. He framed it as pressure from the outside. And the congregation responded the way they always had. With loyalty. But outside the church, the stories were becoming harder to contain. Melissa Grant wasn't the only former staff member speaking quietly anymore. A second therapist came forward. Then a third. Each described the same pattern. Clinical notes stored in shared systems. Administrative staff instructed to flag certain clients. Pastoral leadership requesting summaries of cases that involved spiritual risk factors. When investigators asked what that meant, the answers were vague. Clients questioning church involvement. Clients reducing attendance. Clients expressing independence from pastoral guidance. In internal emails, those cases were sometimes marked with a single phrase. Follow-up recommended. For years, that follow-up had looked like care. A phone call from Daniel. An invitation to meet. A gentle conversation about staying connected. But when former members were interviewed, some described those meetings differently. They said the conversations often included very specific details. Not just spiritual concerns. Medication changes. Therapy progress. Private family disclosures. Details that had never been shared with Daniel directly. At first, many had assumed their therapists were collaborating with him for their benefit. But investigators discovered something important. Several clients had never given permission for that collaboration. And some therapists hadn't agreed to it either. As word spread, the town began to divide. Local businesses that had once sponsored church events quietly withdrew. Parents began asking questions about the youth programs. A community Facebook group filled with arguments. One post read, "This church saved my marriage. You don't destroy a place like this because of paperwork issues." Another replied, "It's not paperwork if someone has access to your medical history without consent." The arguments weren't really about policies. They were about identity. For many families, Ridgewood Community Church wasn't just a place they attended. It was their social circle. Their support system. Their emotional safety net. If something was wrong there, it meant something was wrong with the foundation of their lives. And that was a truth many people weren't ready to face. Meanwhile, Daniel's behavior didn't change. If anything, he became more visible. More present. He attended small group meetings personally. Hosted additional prayer gatherings. Scheduled more one-on-one sessions. Former staff later said this period felt different. Not panicked. Focused. Like he was reinforcing connections before they could weaken. Attendance remained strong. Donations didn't drop. Publicly, the church looked stable. Privately, something else was happening. People were talking in smaller circles. Quietly. Carefully. Comparing experiences. And for the first time, some of those experiences began to match. One of those conversations involved a couple named Mark and Jenna Collins. They had joined the church during a difficult period in their marriage. Counseling through the church had helped them reconnect. For years, they spoke openly in accountability groups about their struggles. Financial stress. Trust issues. Jenna's anxiety treatment. Everything. Then Mark received a job offer in another state. The salary was higher. The opportunity significant. When they told their group, the reaction was immediate. Concern. Questions about stability. Questions about their support system. Within days, Daniel requested a meeting. According to the Collinses, the conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. Daniel didn't tell them they couldn't move. He simply walked through their recent history. Their past conflicts. Jenna's anxiety. Financial setbacks from earlier years. At one point, he said quietly, "Transitions are risky for couples who've already faced instability." They turned down the job. At the time, they believed they had made a wise decision. But during the investigation, something unsettled them. Daniel had referenced details from Jenna's therapy sessions that she had never shared in any church setting. That realization changed how they understood that conversation. It no longer felt like guidance. It felt informed in a way that shouldn't have been possible. As more accounts surfaced, investigators began examining the counseling center's data systems. What they found wasn't illegal by design. Access levels had simply been expanded over time. Administrative staff could view clinical notes. Leadership accounts had broad permissions. Audit logs were incomplete. There was no single moment where a rule had been clearly broken. Instead, boundaries had gradually dissolved. Piece by piece. Decision by decision. Always justified as necessary for holistic care. But the result was the same. Sensitive mental health information had been accessible to people who were not licensed to see it. And in some cases, it had been used in pastoral conversations. The legal situation became complicated. There were potential violations of privacy laws. Possible licensing breaches. But proving intent was difficult. Daniel had never threatened anyone. He had never publicly disclosed private information. Everything had been framed as care. Concern. Support. The power wasn't in exposure. It was in implication. In the quiet understanding that he knew more than most pastors ever should. Then came the financial review. Originally, investigators weren't looking into church finances. But during interviews, several former members mentioned feeling pressured to give beyond their means. That prompted a closer look at donation patterns. What auditors found wasn't fraud. The money was accounted for. But internal documents showed detailed tracking of individual giving levels. Members were categorized: consistent, increasing, declining. For those marked as declining, notes sometimes appeared beside their names. Schedule pastoral check-in. Again, the action itself wasn't illegal. But combined with everything else, it painted a picture of a system designed to monitor behavior closely. Financially, emotionally, socially, and always with Daniel at the center. By the 10th month of the investigation, regional media picked up the story. The headline wasn't about crime. It was about control. How a trusted pastor built a system of influence using personal data. National outlets began calling. Former members who had stayed silent now faced a choice: speak publicly, or remain part of the silence that had protected the system for years. One by one, some chose to speak. Always carefully. Always emphasizing the same thing: he helped a lot of people. But something about the way information was used didn't feel right. Inside the church, the tone shifted. During a Sunday service, Daniel addressed the situation again. This time, his message focused on loyalty. Community means standing together when misunderstandings arise. It means not allowing outside narratives to define who we are. The congregation applauded. But fewer people lingered afterward. Some left quickly. Some avoided eye contact. And for the first time, a small group gathered in the parking lot, talking in low voices. A week later, the state licensing board released its preliminary findings. The counseling center had failed to maintain proper confidentiality boundaries. Access controls were insufficient. Documentation practices were inconsistent. The center's clinical operations were suspended pending restructuring. It wasn't a criminal charge. But it was the first official confirmation that something had gone wrong. The announcement triggered the church's first visible crisis. Appointments were canceled. Therapists resigned. Families who relied on the services scrambled for alternatives. And for many members, the question they had avoided for months finally surfaced. If the counseling center had crossed ethical lines, what else had been operating without proper boundaries? 2 days after the suspension, Daniel sent a message to the congregation. He described the closure as temporary, administrative, fixable. He asked members to avoid speculation and trust the process. But something had already shifted. For years, his authority had come from certainty. Now, uncertainty had entered the story. And once doubt appears in a system built on trust, it spreads quietly. Conversation by conversation. Realization by realization. Until people begin to re-examine moments that once felt normal. For Karen Ellis, the woman who had ended a relationship years earlier, the investigation changed her memory of that time. She reached out to her former partner. They met for coffee. During the conversation, she realized something painful. The decision she had believed was spiritual wisdom had been heavily influenced by a man who knew her fears, her loneliness, and her history. Information she had shared in confidence. Information that had shaped her choices. After that meeting, Karen contacted investigators. She wasn't accusing Daniel of a crime. But she wanted her experience documented. Because for the first time, she understood something clearly. Influence doesn't have to be forced to be powerful. Sometimes, it just needs access. By the end of the first year, Ridgewood Community Church was still open. Services were still held. Attendance had dropped, but not dramatically. Many members stayed. Some out of loyalty. Some out of uncertainty. And some, because leaving meant rebuilding an entire life outside the system that had shaped it for years. Daniel Mercer still preached every Sunday. Still spoke calmly. Still offered guidance. But now, every word existed under a different light. Because the investigation wasn't over. And the question that remained wasn't whether mistakes had been made. It was how intentional the system had been. And whether the man who built it had done so to help people, or to make sure they never stopped needing him. By the beginning of the second year, Ridgewood no longer felt like the same town. The church still stood at the center, its parking lot filling every Sunday morning. The sign out front still read the same message each week. The building still looked like stability. But inside the community, something quieter had taken hold. People were watching their words. Conversations that once happened openly after service were now shorter, more careful. Members who had shared deeply in accountability groups began offering only surface-level updates. "I'm doing fine. Things are good. No major struggles right now." For years, honesty had been encouraged. Now, restraint felt safer. Because once people began to understand how information moved through the system, vulnerability no longer felt like healing. It felt like exposure. Investigators were still building their case, but progress was slow. There was no single incident to point to. No dramatic moment. What they were looking at was a pattern. A structure of influence built over more than a decade. And patterns are harder to prosecute than events. Still, one development changed the direction of the investigation. A former IT contractor contacted the state attorney's office. His name was Andrew Lawson. Andrew had worked briefly with the church 2 years earlier, helping upgrade their internal database systems. At the time, the project seemed routine. Member records, donation tracking, group assignments. But during the upgrade, Andrew noticed something unusual. Multiple databases had been merged. Church membership records, counseling intake information, small group notes, volunteer evaluations, all connected under a single administrative dashboard. When he asked about access permissions, he was told the system needed to be centralized for pastoral oversight. At the time, he didn't question it. But when the investigation became public, he went back and reviewed his archived documentation. What he found concerned him. The highest level of access belonged to one account: Pastor Daniel Mercer. That discovery didn't prove wrongdoing. But it confirmed something investigators had suspected. Daniel wasn't just receiving information from others. He had direct access to the full picture. Financial behavior, emotional struggles, therapy summaries, group leader reports, attendance patterns. Over time, he had been able to see shifts in a person's life before they ever spoke to him directly. Which explains something former members had described repeatedly. He always seemed to know when something was wrong. As investigators interviewed more people, a psychological pattern began to emerge. Members didn't describe feeling threatened. They described feeling understood, seen, anticipated. When someone started missing small group meetings, Daniel would reach out. When donations declined, he would schedule a conversation about stress or fear. When someone withdrew socially, he would invite them for coffee. The timing felt almost intuitive. But with the database records in hand, investigators realized it wasn't intuition. It was monitoring. Around the same time, the financial review expanded. Again, there was no evidence of theft. But auditors found something else. A discretionary fund controlled directly by Daniel. Officially, it was used for emergency assistance, rent support, medical bills, utility payments. And many members had benefited from it. But the distribution records showed a pattern. Assistance often followed periods of increased involvement. Higher giving, leadership participation, volunteer commitments. In interviews, several former recipients described feeling deeply grateful. But some also said the support came with an unspoken expectation. Stay connected. Stay committed. Stay loyal. One former staff member explained it simply. It wasn't that help was conditional. It was that once you received help, you felt like leaving wasn't an option anymore. Gratitude can create a powerful bond, especially when it arrives during someone's most vulnerable moment. As the investigation progressed, media attention intensified. A national documentary crew arrived in Ridgewood. They interviewed former members, therapists, and community leaders. For the first time, the story moved beyond policies and procedures. It became a psychological case study. How influence builds. How dependence forms. How control can grow quietly inside systems that appear supportive. Inside the church, attendance began to decline more noticeably. Not in large waves. Just a few families each week. Quiet departures. No announcements. No confrontations. Some members simply stopped coming. Others attended less frequently. A few transferred to nearby churches. But leaving wasn't easy. For many families, their closest friendships existed inside Ridgewood. Their social calendars revolved around church events. Their children's activities were connected to youth programs. Leaving meant starting over. And starting over is one of the strongest forces that keeps people in place. Then came the moment that changed everything. The state attorney's office announced a formal investigation into potential violations of privacy and professional boundaries. It wasn't a criminal charge yet. But it was the first time Daniel Mercer's name appeared in an official legal inquiry. That Sunday, the sanctuary was full. Daniel stood at the pulpit longer than usual before speaking. When he finally did, his tone was steady. But the message was different. "I want you to hear this from me," he said. "I have never used information to harm anyone. Everything I have done has been for the purpose of helping people heal, grow, and stay connected." He paused. "If mistakes were made in our systems, we will correct them. But the heart behind this work has always been care." Many people cried. Some applauded. But others watched silently. Because for the first time, the conversation wasn't about outside pressure. It was about intent. And intent is harder to defend when the system itself suggests control. 2 weeks later, investigators obtained internal communication records. Emails between leadership staff. Meeting summaries. Strategic planning notes. Most of the content focused on growth and community development. But one document stood out. It was a leadership planning memo written 5 years earlier. The subject line read, "Retention Strategy." The memo outlined methods to keep members engaged long-term. Strong relational bonds. High participation levels. Early intervention when involvement declined. And one line that would later appear in national headlines. Members who feel fully known are less likely to disengage. When reporters asked Daniel about the memo, he said the phrase had been taken out of context. But for many former members, the wording confirmed what they had already begun to feel. Being known hadn't just been care. It had been strategy. As legal pressure increased, several senior leaders resigned. Publicly, they cited personal reasons. Privately, some told investigators they had grown uncomfortable with how much authority had been centralized. Decisions that once involved leadership teams were increasingly made by Daniel alone. Access permissions. Data integration. Pastoral interventions. Over time, the structure had become less collaborative. More concentrated. Meanwhile, the town itself was changing. Local cafes that once hosted church meetings saw fewer large groups. School administrators reported declining participation in church-sponsored programs. Community partnerships quietly dissolved. For years, Ridgewood Community Church had functioned like a social anchor. Now, that anchor was loosening. And with it, the sense of certainty many residents had relied on. The formal findings were released 18 months after the investigation began. The counseling center had violated multiple confidentiality standards. Sensitive mental health information had been accessed by unauthorized individuals. Data systems had failed to maintain professional boundaries. The center's license was permanently revoked. No criminal charges were filed. But the report included a direct recommendation. Leadership practices demonstrated a pattern of excessive personal data integration inconsistent with ethical care standards. It was the closest any official document came to naming the real issue. Not a crime. A system built without limits. Within a week of the report's release, the church board made its decision. Pastor Daniel Mercer would step down. The announcement described it as a mutual agreement. A transition for healing. A new season for the church. Daniel addressed the congregation one final time. He didn't apologize directly. Instead, he spoke about complexity. About leadership under pressure. About the difficulty of carrying responsibility for so many lives. And then he said something that would stay with many people long after he left. When you care deeply about people, the line between helping and holding on can become hard to see. After his resignation, Daniel moved out of Ridgewood. No public interviews. No new church position. No formal charges. Legally, the story ended quietly. But psychologically, the impact continued. Because the hardest part for many former members wasn't anger. It was confusion. They had been helped, supported, guided, and controlled. All at the same time. Years later, Ridgewood Community Church still exists under new leadership. The counseling center is gone. Data policies are strict. Accountability groups focus only on voluntary sharing. Attendance has stabilized, though it never returned to its peak. Some families never came back. Others stayed and rebuilt. But the culture is different now. More cautious. More aware. Because the town learned something difficult. Control doesn't always come through force. Sometimes it comes through care. Through attention. Through understanding people so deeply that they begin to trust your voice more than their own. And by the time they realize the difference, they're not sure how to separate guidance from influence. Or support from dependence. As for Daniel Mercer, his name appears occasionally in leadership conferences and online forums. He speaks about organizational systems, community engagement, retention. But in Ridgewood, people remember something else. Not a criminal. Not a monster. But a man who understood a simple truth. If you know people's fears, their struggles, their private doubts, you don't need to control them directly. Because most of the time, they'll do it themselves.